The last element that I want us to be thinking about when we are considering the Middle Ages as sowing the roots for the modern world, and why it's probably not fair to call it a dark age. The last one relates to the Catholic Church, and likewise the Black Death. So, during the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church, during the High Middle Ages, really, I should say, the Catholic Church was really the central political authority. Okay. Now, it is a bit of a misunderstanding that people think this was like a universal authority, but in reality, the power of the Catholic Church really developed over time, and I'll talk about that here in just a second. Of course, remember, here you see the Papal States. The Catholic Church is traditionally centered here in Rome, in the Vatican, which is a microstate to this day. And you can go visit this area if you ever go to Rome. Absolutely, you should visit the Vatican. This is where, of course, the Sistine Chapel is. This is where the Basilica of St. Peter's, massive cathedral dome that the Catholic Church built, and also contributed to the resistance that led to the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, which begins in earnest at the beginning of the 1500s or 16th century. So here's a look at Europe during the High Middle Ages. Here, of course, the Byzantine Empire centered at Constantinople, the Holy Roman Empire, which, of course, this was built out of the Carolingian Empire, most associated with King Charlemagne's being crowned, probably unexpectedly, by the Pope in 800 AD or CE, and this becomes a Christian domain under the influence of the Catholic Church, but ruled through secular kings, the Carolingian kings, and then later, during the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation, particularly the Habsburg kings like Charles V, for example. And, of course, includes the domains of many different kingdoms, and we'll be talking about that, the ramifications of the Protestant Reformations to that as we move forward in the class. So, when we think about the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages, we often think that the Catholic Church is, or was, this like all-powerful entity that held all this sway for 1,000 years until the coming of the Protestant Reformation. And that's actually really a misunderstanding. In truth, during the early Middle Ages, the Catholic Church was really, to a large degree, often at the sway of middle-aged, during the early Middle Ages, of warlords that would pillage monasteries or churches for their money. There was even a period of time in the early Middle Ages where those warlords started to appoint their own people to run various church affairs, meaning people that were not appointed by the Pope. And of course, if you know anything about this history at all, you know that in order for an individual to be of any significant power in the Catholic Church as a priest or so forth, they have to be appointed by the Pope. That's what gives them. They have to be ordained. That's what gives them their religious authority, if you will. Well, there's a period of time during the early Middle Ages where effectively the middle-aged warlords of Europe effectively just ignored that. And they were appointing and putting their own people in power, and the reason was largely for the purpose of money. Because the church would bring in, lots of money from its constituents, from its farm fields and so forth, from tithing and so forth. And as a result of that, it was one of the most reliable sources of income in Europe. And the warlords would appoint people because they knew that if they appointed someone, that person, while not ordained, that person could then give them a cut of the money. And so it became a monetary thing. So the Catholic Church during the early Middle Ages really wasn't the most powerful political vehicle in Europe. It becomes so during the High Middle Ages, and a lot of this has to do with the reforms of Pope Gregory VII. So Pope Gregory VII would take a number of actions to effectively position the Catholic Church as the preeminent power in Europe. And now it must be remembered that part of the reason they're able to do this is because since the Carolingian Empire, remember the Carolingian Empire's sort of basis of power to a large degree had to do with their ability to promote Catholicism. So while the vast majority of the European population was illiterate, they had an understanding, the people of Europe understood that if you sort of wanted to go to heaven, if you wanted to be saved, that you had to have the sacraments, you had to be able to do confession, you had to have communion, you had to be able to be baptized by an ordained representative of the church. And so during the period of time where that wasn't occurring, where you had the warlords, lay investiture, you had the warlords appointing their own people, there was a popular movement in Europe. Probably the first mass popular movement in Europe ever in reaction to that. And people started rising up and they were protesting this. And this gives power to the Catholic Church to be able to say the people need this, the people want this. And Gregory VII really responds. Gregory VII declares the church the vicar of heaven on earth, meaning only the church could effectively guarantee a person's salvation. Only ordained people by the church. Likewise, Pope Gregory VII banned lay investiture in church affairs. What does that mean? That just means they banned the idea that a non-ordained church individual can appoint anybody to be involved in church affairs. Which, by the way, is why I have this picture here that I took. And you can tell that I took it because it's not the greatest picture, but I wanted to give us an idea of how high up this castle is. This is the Hohensalzburg Castle, and this is the area of the church just below it in Salzburg, Austria. And the reason I have this here is because at this very time, there was a conflict that occurred between the king here and the church over this very thing, lay investiture in church affairs. And even though this castle is basically, it's effectively, you really can't conquer it from a military standpoint. It's high up on a precipice with huge ramparts. Conquering it at that time period with a traditional sort of battle, not happening. But the leader had to give in because his people strongly resisted the idea that a non-ordained person could or should be administering any of the church sacraments and affairs. I should also note that the Gregorian reforms, Pope Gregory VII too, this speaks to Middle-Age Europe, there was a tremendous amount of war in Middle-Age Europe, and Pope Gregory was also the champion of the Gregorian reforms that actually sought to limit conflict by establishing the rules of war that would be sort of acceptable wars in the eyes of God, if you will, and in the eyes of church, because there was almost continual warfare amongst different kingdoms, against these different ruling warlords, if you will. And so there were a lot of reforms that the Catholic Church took to sort of limit the extent to which fighting and conflict was occurring in Europe during this transition point during the early and high Middle Ages. During the height of the power of the Catholic Church, probably occurred during the time of Pope Innocent III, who used things like the interdict, which could involve excommunications of people who refused to cooperate with the decrees of the church. Pope Innocent III even called crusades in Europe against individuals deemed to be practicing heresy. The Albigensian Crusade, or the Cathars Crusade, was the most notorious example of this. The Albigensians or the Cathars were a Christian group, but they didn't recognize the authority of the Catholic Church, in part because they believed in a philosophy that anything made of man, of the earth, was effectively connected to sin. And so effectively, from their standpoint, the Catholic Church could never be this. The material world was sort of inherently polluted with the sins of man, and Pope Innocent ordered an interdict on them and resulted even in the slaughter of women and children in some cases, even taking refuge in a church at the time in the Cathars Crusade, also known as the Albigensian Crusade, but representative of the really total power of the Catholic Church at that time, relative total power at that time during the High Middle Ages. Giving rise to the modern era was also partially connected to a weakening of the Catholic Church. So one factor that helps to lead to the emergence of modernity comes with the Protestant Reformation, a breaking up of the political power of the Catholic Church. And when that occurred, that gave rise to the emergence of a myriad of different new interpretations of government. Absolute monarchy in France, republics in places like the Dutch Republic, ultimately constitutional monarchies in places like England. So the Protestant Reformation and the weakening of the Catholic Church at the end of the Middle Ages gives rise, in a lot of sense, to the roots of the modern nation-state system. And we're going to talk more about that as we get into the Protestant Reformation. We talk about developments like the 30 Years' War. But the first step in this really comes with the event called the Avignon Captivity of the Papacy, and in connection to it, the Black Death. So this is another photo I took. This is the Palace of the Popes in Avignon, France. For nearly a century, in the 1300s, the Pope was residing in France, in Avignon, which is an amazing place to visit, by the way. If you ever have a chance to get to southern France, you've got to go to Avignon. It's a little medieval city, and you can come and see this amazing palace, which has an incredible history tour, by the way. It's really, really neat. You get a little iPad or a little tablet, and it shows you, you can walk around, and it'll show you what each room would have looked like at the time. But the papacy is supposed to be in Rome, is the point. And during this time period of the so-called Avignon captivity of the papacy, there's a period of time here where there's multiple popes elected. At one time, there's a pope in Italy, and there's a pope in France. And the French delegations won't accept the pope in France. The Italian delegations won't accept the pope in Italy. Or the French delegation won't accept the pope in Italy. The Italian delegation won't accept the French pope. There was even one time where there were 3 popes. What this means is that a lot of times folks start to, at this time period, people start to question the legitimacy of the religious authority in their own area. And this leads to a weakening of the influence and power of the Catholic Church. What made matters worse is at that very same time, Europe will experience the Black Death. Sometimes environmental crises can shape history. It's shaped by people, of course. This is one of the grand lessons of history, is people are agents and they can play a role in shaping the future, shaping history. But it can also be shaped by things out of the control of people, or at least largely out of control of people. It can be shaped by environment. In 1300, Europe was really at its environmental carrying capacity, which is around about 78 million. And as you move into the 1300s, you witness the development of events like the Little Ice Age, maybe caused by volcanic eruptions in Iceland. But there's a cooling of the climate for a short period of time that resulted in a famine in which 10% of the European population passed. You had a weak society as a result that was prone to disease. People's diets are not as good, and as a result, they're more prone to infectious disease. You also had war, of course. You had the 100 Years' War, and that makes matters worse. You have farm fields being destroyed, people fighting, people not attending to the fields, and so forth. And then to make matters worse, this all culminates with the development, to kind of build on top of this, the development of the Black Plague, or the Black Death. Now, I say October 1347 to the 1360s question mark, and the reason I have a question mark there is because the Black Death continued to sort of pop up in pockets following the primary wave of this illness's sweep across Europe. The disease, which had a massive mortality rate, you see 50% mortality rate, it was transferred from fleas that were on rats. And it came first to Sicily, the port of Messina, in northern Sicily, near the southern part of the Italian boot, if you will, the Italian peninsula. And it had been brought by seafarers from the Black Sea. And the ships ported, they had, there's always rats on these ships, and the rats came ashore and brought this disease with the fleas that would bite people and give them this disease. It originated in China. And Europeans had no exposure to this and no antibodies, and as a result, it decimated Western Europe. The population dropped by perhaps as much as a third, even more. From 78 million down by 19 to 38 million people. There were whole towns that became abandoned effectively. Now, why does this play into a fracturing of the Catholic Church? It plays into a fracturing of the Catholic Church. It plays into a fracturing of the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church can't do anything about it. They don't have a solution for this. And so when you couple this with the fact that the church is in Avignon, the church is not in the Vatican, okay, people start to question whether or not the authority of the Pope, Pope Clement at the time, whether or not the Pope's authority was legitimate. Maybe this wasn't. Maybe the Catholic Church is not legitimate, this church in Avignon. In addition, the papacy had no solution for it. And so people further question the authority and the political power of the Catholic Church. This is a longer-term development. The effect on the population, it's like people thought this was the end of the world. Anybody, and the people who wrote primary sources at the time, basically said that anybody who was exposed in the slightest sense to anybody who had this would get this and they would die. And the death was often highly just horrifying, vomiting blood for 3 days kind of thing. In Europe, you saw your rich and wealthy lords would flee to the countryside. They would leave the towns. People in some cases engaged in hedonistic behavior, fearing that it was the end of the world. Some people took up extreme monasticism. Asceticism means to deny oneself, like food and sustenance, because they thought it was human sin that was causing it, that God was punishing people. There were groups like the Flagellants, who were first called by the Pope and then eventually turned against the Pope. And the Flagellants, they practiced self-flagellation. So they would beat each other or beat themselves, hoping that their own punishment would be enough to secure the mercy of God, if you will. The Flagellants, too, accused Jewish people of poisoning the drinking water, which led to persecutions of Jewish people. These are called pogroms. The Pope tried to stop them, but they even turned against the Pope. And in some cases, the Flagellants would break into sermons and disrupt Catholic masses in protest to the Catholic Church. As a result of these persecutions, you had a movement of many Jewish people into Eastern Europe, where there, of course, develops a very significant Jewish population. Other ramifications, of course, are higher wages. So the fall in the workforce means there's greater power to the peasants. So this gives rise to higher wages for peasants in the Western European economic landscape. It also gives greater rise to a focus on new forms of philosophy, humanism particularly, and this helps to give rise to different forms of thought that react to medieval thought, in some cases maybe criticize medieval thought, and helps to give rise to the emergence of the modern world. as new centers of power and new forms of thought emerge in the space left by the Black Death and the fracturing of the authority of the Catholic Church.